Next presentation is going to be Mr. Neil McDonald. Neil was also, I think, the Director of Livestock in Northern Territory, as well as the Director of the Catherine Research Station. And Neil's going to talk to us a little bit different topic around the importation of Australian breeding cows into Indonesia, and some of the applications and insights and relevant things that could be for Vietnam. Yeah, so yeah, Neil, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rod. And yes, as you said, I'm going to talk about importation of Australian Brahman heifers into Indonesia from North Australia, and what we've learned from this exercise. Is in 2015, one of the provinces in Indonesia imported just over 2,000 Brahman cross heifers to distribute to small farmers as a rural development project and for poverty alleviation. And they chose to have 60% of them pregnant and 40% not pregnant. The project started really badly. They brought them in too late in the year. They were heavily pregnant into the wet season. And there was a very high death rate in quarantine. Some of the quarantine yards were not ready. And as a result, the Australian government funded technical support, got the Northern Territory Department to provide technical support for 2 years. And we were also assisted by the importer and by MLA, by the exporter, I'm sorry, the Australian exporter. It was a difficult project. And the first year was very difficult. But by the end, it was really a great success and provided a good income from farmers. And we kept monitoring them till the end of 2019. So Indonesia and Vietnam are not the same. And some of the issues would not be relevant for Vietnam, but some would. And importation of productive breeders is a possible way of rapidly introducing productive genetics, as well as increasing the size of Vietnam's domestic cattle herd, which is something that both Indonesia and Vietnam are trying to do. And because this is a real live example, we can talk very honestly about what went well and what went badly. And I might just mention also that a company called Great Giant in Indonesia later on ran a rather similar project in Sumatra, and it worked pretty well too. So the first decision is, should you import heifers or should you import mature cows? And should they be pregnant or not pregnant? And there's no easy answer to that because there's advantages and disadvantages of each. With heifers, you get the maximum time in of their life in your herd. They're much easier to buy in large numbers from Australia. Steve Petty yesterday said that he had thousands of them ready to go, pregnant or not pregnant. You've got less chance that they've been selected, that they've been picked because they're not good performers, because there's actually not really any selection on these heifers. And even though they're not selected for fertility, in fact, the rate of numbers that are infertile are terribly low, so it doesn't really matter. The big disadvantages of heifers from North Australia, and particularly Brahmans, is that they have difficulty conceiving their second calf when they're lactating. So they often take a year off. And the graph I've shown is just an approximation of what a lot of the performance in North Australia is like. They're mated as 2-year-olds. They calve first as a 3-year-old, a few of them a little bit earlier. And then the next year, there's a great big dip in performance until after 5, they're mature cows. And there's complicated reasons for this, and there are some solutions, the best solution being very early weaning. If you import cows, they're experienced breeders, they should give a calf for you almost every year, and they're better mothers, they're fully grown, so you get much more cow for your money when it comes to be slaughtered. And in Australia, we tend to cull our cows for age, from the age of 10, because we deal in large numbers and we can't look at them individually. But in Vietnam, as in Indonesia, you have the time to have a look at them individually, pick those with good teeth and with good condition, and they can give calves along quite a few years after the age of 10. If you do buy cows, it makes much more sense to buy them pregnant. If it's heifers, should you import them pregnant or not pregnant? Well, if you buy a pregnancy tested calf heifer, it means you get an extra Australian bred calf, as Steve was mentioning yesterday. You can be sure that she's not infertile, and you get better cash flow, quicker return. The disadvantage of that is to do with the time of the year, because in North Australia, you've got a distinct wet season from about November through to April, and on November to March. And most of the calves are born right at the beginning of the wet season. And then the big stations can't muster the cattle until the end of the wet season. So by the time they get to muster, the heifers are already about 5 months pregnant on average. And Australian regulations prevents exporting pregnant cows more than 190 days pregnant, or about 6 months. So you've got this very, very narrow window of time at the beginning of the dry season, around about June, to select your heifers, put them through quarantine, and ship them. It's risky, and it may be possible, but it's a difficulty you have to be aware of. I won't dwell too much on the way that the farmers these were managed and so on. They were in groups. It was good for training. The main thing about that was that the leadership of each farmer group was terribly important. There were 25 farmers on average in each group, 50 cows, and when they were well led, every cow in the cooperative was in good condition. In some cases they weren't, in which case the cows got taken away and given to better farmers. And a lot of these farmers were chosen by the government, and they'd never had cattle before, so they were. If we'd designed it, we wouldn't have designed it that way. They built infrastructure to house the cattle, and generally they did it very well. They were worried about animal behavior because, as you've heard from Tim, these cattle in North Australia only handled twice a year. They're pretty wild sometimes, and the people were very scared of this. But after a month or so of handling in Indonesia, they were perfectly well behaved, and there were no complaints whatsoever about behavior. First thing we spent the whole of the first year doing was trying to persuade the farmers that productive cattle need more feed than the local, less productive ones. And it was difficult, but by the end of the year, they'd pretty well learned, and there were no animal welfare issues by the end of by the second year. Now, In Australia, of course, we do a lot of grazing. Indonesia, rather like Vietnam, has not got the large areas to graze. About 20% of the groups had the option of grazing either on old coal mining areas or on oil palm plantations. And that was very successful and a good option if it's available. But I realize that's possibly not the case in Vietnam. Oil palm plantation was one of the main drivers of this exercise, but there are problems with that because when the trees are very young, they don't want the cattle there. And after they're about 12 years old, the trees grow over and there's not much grass underneath. And in Indonesia, a lot of the oil palm plantations are getting quite mature. Indonesia, like Vietnam, relies very much on artificial insemination. And when they didn't bring bulls in originally, Indonesian inseminators are very skilled, very experienced and very skilled. But we were asked, the success rate wasn't great, and we were asked to provide an expert to assess their system. And the two big problems were heat recognition. Brahman cattle very often would go on heat for a few hours in the middle of the night. And when the cows are tied up, then it's very hard to know. When they did recognize that, and in the morning they rang up the inseminator to come on his motorbike, it was too late. And the other one was maintenance of the cold chain. They used to carry the semen around in thermos flasks on their motorbike. We did some studies on that and found a lot of cases the semen straws were not viable. So we provided them with 5 dry shippers, which keep the straws in better condition. That holds the liquid nitrogen and absorbent material, and it's safe to carry around. In North Australia, whenever we do artificial insemination, we always have a bull as well behind. So after 2 rounds or 2 cycles, if the cow has not conceived, then we'll let the bull do the job. And this project did not import bulls at the same time, but the farmers soon recognized that they needed them, and they started buying the bulls themselves. They were ongols, or they used calves born from the project at the beginning. And that worked well, except, of course, that if they're in small groups and they tie the cows up at night, that doesn't work either. There has to be a way the bull can get to the cow. Really important thing, which we had a lot of difficulty persuading the farmers over, was weaning. We believe they should be weaned 4 months between 120, 150 kg, letting the cows to go back into calf. But they didn't want to wean, partly because they wanted maximum growth from their progeny, partly because they didn't have a separate place to move them to. And when they kept the calves at home, the families complained because they made too much noise and kept them awake. So we had situations like this all the time where the calf was fine. The calf was as big as its mother and sucking it. And the end result was we got a lot of very wonderful big progeny, and the farmers were very proud of them. But I think they would have been better to wean and concentrate on fertility. The economics of it are rather strange because in Indonesia, you've got the option sometimes of selling bulls at high price at festival times like Kurban. And you get some insane prices for good bulls sometimes. I won't talk much about animal health, except to say that it was pretty satisfactory, except when at the beginning when the cows were recovering from the stress of quarantine. But once they're on the farms, animal health was not the issue. So just summing up the implications for Vietnam, we can't say which is better. It'll be for different people to decide if they want to have pregnant heifers, non-pregnant heifers, or pregnant cows, all possible. But if they do get heifers from North Australia, you have to recognize there'll be a problem with the second calf. So don't cull them, don't cut their heads off just because they don't conceive straight away the second time. Productive cattle need more feed. If they're grazing, then the grazing time must be long enough. And if they bring them in at night, they have to feed them at night too. Weaning is very important. The problems with artificial insemination were heat detection, maintenance of the cold chain. I think that having some bulls is essential in the system, but if the cows are kept in stalls, tied up, you need to know how the cows and the bulls will get together. We found you didn't have to worry about behavior and didn't really have to worry about animal health. I just want to recognize that Greg Smith, who's here, he was the on-ground manager and responsible more than anyone else for the success of the project. Very sadly, he was killed in an accident after the project finished. There'll be people in the room who knew him. And thank you.